Meta-Rick!
Welcome back to another episode of Meta-Rick, where we talk about emerging technologies with creative technologists, with startup founders. Today, we've got a great guest with us. We have Amir. We talked about it before. Here I am stumbling through names. Bozorgadeh.
Really?
Amir he's the co-founder, CEO of Virtuleap. It's a VR startup that unlocks neuroscience with virtual reality to help increase attention levels and address cognitive illness disorders and learning challenges. This is a topic that has been super interesting to me lately. I've been talking to people a lot about how VR can help reduce the use for medications to avoid issues of overdose and addiction for folks that can't use medication to be treated, and giving them these kind of alternative paths of medicine. So when you reached out about the show, I was like, this is a perfect guy to talk to right now. I'm going to have a ton of follow-up questions for you. But as we get started, maybe we could first just learn a little bit about your story. Tell us a bit about the company and the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again, Ricky, for having me on. I've known of you for quite some time as well. There's a lot of dead bodies in the VR space, a lot of skeletons from the waves that have come and gone. So when you have veterans around, it's good to huddle. My background is a Canadian raised expat since 2008, spent a lot of time in the fields of market research, then games publisher. And then after I had a little foray with a virtual reality simulation that allowed me to not cure, but really address my fear of heights, my vertigo. There's a French studio that made this like bird outfit. You go in and you're flying on top of a tall, New York's landscape. And that made me a believer. I got into the writing about the topic for VentureBeat and Tech Crunch for about 3-4 years, starting in 2015. And then I got into launching Virtuleap in 2018 as a company that was really all about addressing virtual reality's critical applications for education and healthcare as the two specific sectors.
So what was so it sounds like you had this experience, this like aha moment of, wow, I can fly. This experience is so unique. And every founder I've met in the space has a moment like that, where there's this kind of first experience with VR that kind of, I call it catching the bug, right? Like this XR bug. What made you kind of pivot from, I'm going to talk about this and write about it and kind of share this experience, to, wait, I have an idea. Like I actually want to build something in this space.
I still feel like some people go, well, VR is a nice to have technology, like a luxury technology. I don't think they understand the digital sorcery at work when your whole body believes the experience is real. And therefore, in an application like phobia treatment, exposure therapy, pain reduction, all these kinds of things, why is this digital sorcery at work? How does it happen? Well, the part of me, the part of the human experience that is nonverbal, that I typically take for granted, but it's the active component of why my knees shake because of my vertigo. It's not because of my conscious, rational self, which is actually the part that we usually think about. Virtual reality is the first embodied digital format. So when I had that experience, which is a visceral experience, a digital experience that's viscerally engaging, the applications just exploded for me in terms of things that can help us. And that's why those two sectors are really key for me. But, that level of immersion, it makes things possible that simply something that screen-based can never hope to, because, you're typing with your fingers and thumbs. Great, it's accessible, but the level of things that can happen, the magic of the technology is exactly that. And that's what got me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a new medium of communication, right? It's like we had radio shows and then we had television shows, and we went from broadcasting television to streaming television, and now we're going into these kind of 3D kind of virtual mediums of communication. Like there's a layer to how we tell stories. And this medical conference I went to recently kind of opened my eyes to VR in a new way, because they talked about all these examples over not just the last decade, but the last like 40, 50 years of like samples of how VR has been used in the medical space. And it shifted my thinking, where it's like VR is not just engaging and immersive. It's like kind of like brain hacking in a certain way. Like we're basically using illusions to kind of trick the mind into thinking it is somewhere else, right? Like visually, and now with spatial audio through like auditory kind of trickery almost to kind of trick the body into thinking it's something different. And when you think of it that way, I was like, okay, wait, this is medicine in a certain like this is great for medicine because if you're able to trick the brain into thinking something, I mean, that's a big piece of what exposure therapy is about, is taking you back to that place, right? Like making you remember that traumatic incident that you experienced and finding a way to overcome it. So it's interesting when you get into that particular industry. I noticed that a lot of people tend to have some emotional attachment to it in some way. Yeah, if you're going to be excited about solving medical problems or like being able to help with therapeutic kind of issues, like the last guy I talked to that was working in this space, like he was telling me about his grandmother that had Alzheimer's, and so now he's building a company where he raised some funding to try and combat dementia using XR technologies. I wonder, do you have anything like personally associated with it, or what made you decide that you wanted to work on the medical side of VR?
Well, I mentioned my personal vertigo was reduced because of it. So that's the first thing. The second is that I'm a complete nerd when it comes to psychometrics for psychological interventions that are somewhat beyond the superficial layers. The third is my co-founder and CTO, longtime co-founder, 15 years plus working together, Hossein Jalali. His firstborn is diagnosed with something between Asperger's and lately even a form of ADHD, but a significant learning impairment. So it's a bunch of my career and my life. I always like when a few hit a bird with three stones, three birds with one stone, right? It's like things that can like multiple like areas in your life that kind of intersect, because that you need those intersections of interest to have the motivation that goes beyond the bumpy roads. There's plenty of companies that I've seen mentored even in accelerators and so on who just didn't really have that intersection of interest. Once they had one bump in the road, they called it quits or they started panicking. They didn't really, it was just an initial interest, because you have to be a masochist to be in the VR sector, and you have to be a crazy person to be in the VR sector trying to address the most stubborn industries of healthcare and education, which are like very non-willing to be innovative, however much maybe people say otherwise.
So there's something you mentioned kind of as we just like kind of kickstarted the conversation around like being around the industry a long time, right? Like we've watched a lot of people kind of jump in and leave, and it's an industry that you have to really believe in the long term future of where this can go, because it's so early and it's been early. Like you joining back in like 2015, right? Like that's a long time ago. In the VR space, that feels like 20, 30 years, right?
Dog
Like
years.
so much has changed. So talk me through a little bit of when you first started the business. Like, how did you find a good team? What were the factors that brought on good partners and helped you kind of keep going over the course of that 8 years? What helped you stick around?
Talking retrospectively and trying to narrate it, I always find it funny because I really think it's a hallelujah kind of experience. I'm not religious from it, but it's almost like there's the hand of God or the gods. Odin himself has allowed us to. We should not be around right now, is what I'm trying to say. We should not exist. There was so many times, so many crossroads where we could have been like murdered, butchered, killed, maimed, like all of the above, so that I'm even here talking to you about it as if I can narrate it and say these were the key ingredients. I'm just not that person. If I have to be honest with you, I can definitely bullshit and give the Hollywood spiel, but the things that made us survive, let's say why we survived, is in terms of leadership, in terms of our team, no hierarchy, little tolerance for toxic people who might be the best at what they do, but best doesn't really matter so much, in my opinion, because the VR industry is still on wobbly legs. You need to be able to be a cockroach and survive. So harmony and people who are nice and good and kind, and are working to blend together. No one's sticking out in a jagged way, in terms of opportunities, being never listening to investors and focusing only on one thing. Because if you focus on 8 possible steaks in the oven, one of those things comes in the least moment that you never expected to save you. So, things like that are the wrong advice in if you're selling hot dogs online. For me, you have to follow your gizzard a lot in this kind of emerging technology space.
So there's a couple things in there that I want to start with one, and I think that we might circle back to a few of them. But the thing that you talked about the difference in advice that investors typically give versus in this industry, I think that when you have a very established space, a very established industry like SaaS tools for accountants or something, right? Those tools have existed for a long time. There's best practices. There's a whole bunch of ways to successfully build a SaaS tool and get it off the ground and get it out to market. And there's a playbook developed for it. When you're talking about emerging technologies, things that are experimental, things that are getting new hardware every 2 years, things that are having breakthroughs in software development every 6 months, like that's a totally different market to be building a business in. And when you're thinking about building the product technically, when you're thinking about go to market, like all of the playbooks from SaaS and from other areas, they're more like inspiration than they are a playbook. What are some of the things that you feel are different about the VR space that might have gaps in that traditional SaaS playbook? Things that you need to think about differently.
Like a lot. It's very few of us, unless you're a VR company that at one point or another started accepting agency work. Because I saw a lot of companies, especially in the early days, if you wanted to survive, you had to go that route, or you didn't, and you really went hardcore in such a way that you made it work with funding. But once you did agency work, you basically weren't a startup anymore in my eyes. You're not a VC-backed formula startup. That is not the definition. You cannot call yourself a startup if you're doing agency work. Find a little exceptions. We even did some recent stuff that we had to in bad times, but quickly we got rid of it, came back to startup formula, which means you are product oriented only to your solution, and ideally you have a product that's going to be scalable in a SaaS model eventually. We're still not there. We're still in pilot purgatory or pilotitis, what do you want to call it, where we're doing sometimes big studies with hospital partners, research partners, clinics, a lot of cool things, but a lot of those cool things are long cycles before we can ever convert them into a multi-year licensing deal or something like that. So they're like, the scale of it is just much longer in the science side of things anyways. Even us not being a VR company, but a science R&D company, even R&D companies have this problem that you're talking about in general with VCs that are trying to take the SaaS models and bring it to you, ask you for a 5-year forecast. I mean, what insanity is that? I mean, fine, they want to see that you know how to put an Excel together, know what the costing is and expenses, but they want literally, they want 5-year forecast. They want to know what their exit's going to be, and you can't talk about exits in that same fashion. You can't talk about IPOs in that fashion. The only way that I can approach it is by going to investors that are thematically aligned with, let's say, a very important social impact therapeutic area like Alzheimer's disease, like ADHD, and then they have a strategic need for this, and they understand the long haul. But those are very few and far between. That's why so few of us have survived. And you need to have a mix of knowing that you're not going to have investors as your primary win. You're going to have to really get in it and find grants. Research grants were something I really should have done much earlier than I started. Those are things that you can plug in and then have reaped maybe the time that you're about to die financially from private financing, foundations, from competitions, from everything, man. We were surviving at one point based on a prize competition in China. It was the most rare, weird thing to happen. That was what saved us at one period. So it's versatility, and honestly, we just don't have the right playbook to give VCs the answers that they want. We don't have a mainstream. Oculus, Meta, and all these folks never give us the data to even understand the market. We have no transparency on even what their B2C market is. How little have they even focused on the B2B stuff until very recently?
I think I've experienced something similar to what you're talking about, but maybe you could explain when you say agency work, what do you mean by that?
Basically, putting up your team at the service of doing contracts for anyone and everyone. Maybe you want even a theme, but really you're saying I'll do anything for hire. You're a Ronin, right? You're not serving no Shogun, the startup mission. It's like anybody who comes in and pays you, you're gonna contract yourself for even up to like years to do something. So now you said you were at first a VR company that's revolutionizing, let's say, architecture. You were doing that. Then you couldn't raise your fund. You're like dying. Your what, your family's going, how are you going to eat? You're not getting an income. Oh my God, the stress. And so you just kind of bastardize your dream or whatever that was into something that makes you short-term cash.
Yeah, I think it sounds like what you're talking about is like services, right? So like offering service offerings
Yeah.
that may or may not align well with the product that you're building. There's versions of this that I think can be good. So like a lot of the best tech products in the world were services first, and then essentially the team providing those services just was optimizing as many parts of the service as possible and trying to productize it. So for example, like one of the first startups I worked for was a company called Snapwire, and we were helping brands scale photo video production. And essentially, we were an agency, right? Like we had a team of project managers. We delivered services where we would scope out the creative needs of the visual content that we needed to produce, and then we would come up with a production plan, and then we would source from our network of creators people to assign those jobs to. But what we were building while we were delivering those service-based projects is a platform that was essentially a marketplace of creative talent, and then optimizing how to tag and find the best talent for projects, and then how to optimize getting the right talent to sign up and take the project, and then how to brief that talent so they understand the creative vision of what I need them to execute on. And then over time, what we ended up with was this really amazing marketplace for brands to come in on their own and be able to source creators. And we could cut out the need for that service model to be the core revenue and allow that to be like a more premium offering for like enterprise brands or something.
Mm.
So I think there's times where services can be good as long as you're tying them in and aligning them with the product that you're building. And it's there's like a goal of why you provide them. I think where it goes wrong is when companies end up wanting to call themselves a SaaS product or a tech product because they want an evaluation to like go up like crazy. And then they start taking on all these I need to mess with my settings, man. This keeps happening. These
I know,
random
happened to
like
me
thumbs
today
ups
as
and stuff.
well. No, I agree with you, Ricky. What you're saying, though, from my experience, as someone even who wrote for tech blogs about startups of various kinds, and I was deep into the ecosystems. That's a very rare example you're talking about. Usually, when they go down that road, they're not really continuing. They cannibalize their resources in such a way that they're no longer building up their platform, and it's kind of a slow death. And one thing that VCs, at least most top VCs, if they look at that at all, they're not interested in you. At least the top tier VCs. I mean, at the pre-seed, seed stage level, if you're doing that and they see you doing that, they don't think you're the kind of founders that's going to be the long haul. You're not really kung fu high enough level for them, in my experience. But what you just described was a very neat, clever way of tying the both.
But it's hard, right? And like I don't necessarily think we did a spectacular job of it either. Like there were flaws in that model because one of the drawbacks is, to your point, like services become a distraction from the core product offering. Like if you're offering services, what you need to build might differ slightly than the technology that a client might need if they're using it externally, and like prioritizing the needs of your internal service team versus the needs of your future clients. Like it becomes a challenging thing to balance. And I think what often happens is people stumble into offering services that are further and further away from their core products. And then they become essentially a small niche agency that
Yeah.
doesn't commit to being an agency.
I mean, yeah, they remind me of conference organizers. It's like, it's just like kind of like a lot of people who got into VR, I really don't think they cared that it was VR. I think a lot of the people in certain beginning of waves, I know examples of them. They're the ones who created all those nausea-inducing kind of experiences, just building fast things, showing them in conferences, trying to make quick bucks. The sharks out there. I feel like sometimes it really, when you get to the hit against the wall, it's when you realize, are you really in this? Is it about pride, or is it a dream? How do you not do that agency work? First of all, did you look into it? Maybe are you going full Rocky Balboa, or are you doing bandage work whenever there's a problem? You know what I mean? Are you changing it up every time something negative happens? Like, we went through months where we couldn't pay salaries until the last moment. The level of stress to be able to manage that, tolerate that, kind of what you have to endure. I know from my experience, many startups did not do what we did in terms of that. Not stamina building. No one wants to do that, but we kept on going. We kept on looking under every freaking stone possible. And I know for a fact from lots of experiences, some people just don't do that. And so VR in these territories, I think it's a very what is it, connoisseur sort of masochist realm to jump into, especially at this stage, but much better these days.
It takes a special personality for sure to hop into an emerging industry that's like not like a playbook ready, where you've got to wear a lot of hats, you got to experiment, you're going to be wrong a lot. Like there's a lot of having to kind of stumble through it. And I really like the way that you talk about, as a founder, like it is a game of survival. It is a game of being the cockroach in the nuclear war, right? Like you have to kind of keep on finding ways to stick around. And that's why it's called a venture in the first place, is it's an adventure. Like it's about just continuing to move forward and grow and progress. It's something that's interesting about your background, though, is this isn't the first startup that you've done, right? Like you're not a first time founder with this. Like before Virtuleap, you also founded Gameguise, which was a mobile game studio. So it seems like you might actually have some background in the agency world in Dubai. And then I
I
think that
do.
you also started a social impact startup to introduce time banking into the Middle East. And so you have a little bit of background as a founder. Maybe you could talk us through those two experiences and kind of what you learned from that, that you've applied to Virtuleap.
Yeah, before I did Virtual Leap, I never wanted to start a startup, until I saw that like wow moment of VR and my, of the therapeutic value of it. When I became convinced of it, it was kind of like a sorcery on me as well, right? Before, I think pre that experience, Amir Bozorgadeh did not ever want to. All I saw with startups was the suffering. I was like, I didn't really want to be part of that. Then after the experience, it's kind of like the call. I think it's the hero's call, right? If you bring in Campbell into this kind of idea, and it's the hero's call that kind of just changed up my mentality. The two previous companies, I would say, Time Dirham was a startup, but it was a something that we were working side by side with the government of Dubai. We were trying to create social cohesion through a very innovative idea that allowed people to trade and accept services from one another through a currency that's based on social, time. It was a really beautiful experience building it, and then
Wait, is that kind of wait? Hold up, is that like that movie with Justin Timberlake? Like
no, no,
the time is the currency.
no, no. That's so evil, that movie, and I can't believe I liked it. Actually, I didn't really want to like it, but I liked it. It's such a B-rated. Time banking is really beautiful. It's actually originated. First name is Edgar. I forget his last name, but he's the founder in the U.S. When you, let's say you have a kid, you find me on the time banking portal, someone who teaches guitar. I give an hour of service teaching your child guitar lessons, and because of that hour that I gave you a service on the time banking portal, I've earned a time dollar. And that time dollar now I can spend on having someone maybe come and fix my sink. Something like this. It's a time banking is a way of social cohesion, social, mixing of skills without having dollars and currency, act as barriers.
How does it get started though? Is there like an initial like bank of time dollars that kind of kick things off for the community, or like because if everyone starts at zero?
Yeah. Um, this is literally 10, 11, 12 years ago. It's funny that we're talking about it because that's a different person in a way. But for us, the news coverage, thankfully, was so wild when we first launched that the main newspapers, the big ones in Dubai, covered it. I had some connections, I guess, back then, and boom, we had thousands of users come in right away and kind of set up their profiles, and just, I don't know, some kind of like climax just happened literally in the first week of those news reports going out. But if they didn't, I see what you mean. It just that it, a lot of successes, especially the ones that people talk about at panels, it's sometimes just like things happened. You don't know why. You can explain it like you're a genius, but I don't buy that. I feel it's kind of like that.
So imagine that working with kind of the government agencies for part of that and kind of getting that off the ground ties in a little bit with Virtuleap's a unique product, right? Because if you're focused on neuroscience and like helping with attention levels, cognitive illness, disorders, like you mentioned earlier, like getting government grants or like getting funding through a different way outside of VCs, and I think that's really common. Like when you're doing research, and especially in the medical field, like a lot of funding tends to come through grants and research grants and not from traditional kind of VC startup paths. What do you think is the process of that, right? Like if someone wants to go out and like find grant money
Hmm.
and they don't know how to do it, what would be your advice on like how to get started and go through that process?
In the US, you got so much amazing resources available, but the process of writing a grant, it's something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It's not a fun process. It is awful, awful, awful. And then you can find some people who have like some kind of mental health disorder that like makes them a lot like doing grant applications. You have to find those people who have that disease because they're just amazing. And you find people like that. That means the process is much more easy. Especially people who have experience writing it. The portals for finding them. You need to know what are the portals. You got, and like for example, in our sector, you have in the U.S. you have the NIH, you have the SBIR, you have a lot of these kind of organizations that work together. Sometimes there's so many like things out there that are in the directories. You have to just go and check out what's available first. Then you look for someone on LinkedIn, for example, and see if they can join up your company in a limited capacity, even and reduce their fees, or even join in a fuller capacity. And because grant writing is extremely important for if you are applicable, like R&D oriented. But again, it can take minimum 6 months, maybe up to a year, even more sometimes, to get that money. Sometimes there's a lot of stories here in Europe where you get the money and then you die before you even receive it. So it's a funny thing in
Oh
itself. So
no.
no,
I think
this
people
is
make
very
jokes
common.
about like that show One Piece that there's people that haven't been able to finish the series because they die before the next season comes out.
It's just like, there's no like utopia in any of this. It's humor, like, you laughing right now. It's the key to a lot of stuff. And you just have to be like really okay with ambiguity. I think that the big five personality test, I'm really big on that, because people who are really good at corporates, middle managers, people who usually serve as big barriers for startup people, they usually have completely like diametrically opposite personality compositions. Like startups have more like psychological characteristics akin to artists on the, the starving artist sort of disposition, whereas the people who are in VCs or corporates, they're the opposite, diametrically opposite. So they're like two different species trying to talk to one another. And in fact, startup founders with this like, openness and agreeableness and creativity kind of aspect and risk appetite, they're like, they're barriers. They're like video game levels ahead of them is populated completely with people who don't have those traits. In fact, they don't value those traits. They value the opposite ones. So it's an interesting
Yeah,
ballet.
yeah, there's a huge difference in personality types and where we all fit in culture. I was interviewing the CTO from Azure Games, Travis Bourdreau, and he was talking about when he's because he's also an angel investor and invests in startups and stuff. And he was like, there's product market fit, and that's important, but there's also founder product market fit. So like, does the founder fit the product? Like, do they have some sort of experience that ties to it, or a unique POV, or like something that they can bring to the table for that product in that industry that's different, or just very good fit? And then the second is like founder market fit, right? So like there's some founders that are amazing at going from 0 to 1 and like going through all of the survival stuff that we've talked about of like getting from 0 to 1 million or from 1 million to 10 million. But then there's other founders that are much better at taking that 10 million and turning it into 100 million, or 100 million and going to a billion. And those are almost always very different people. It's so rare that you end up with like a Jensen for Nvidia, or like a Zuck at Facebook or Meta. Like having somebody that can go from 0 to 1 to a billion is like a very rare thing, because they have to change themselves a bit and kind of adapt to a new environment and a new type of business that they need to be operating. It's a different skill set. And it's really hard to do that without losing yourself. Like being able to find a way to maintain your values and like maintain creativity and pushing boundaries. And, a lot of people will say what they will about Meta, but that's one area where I really admire and kind of respect Mark Zuckerberg, is his ability to kind of push that boundary, even as such a big company, and take the risk of throwing this much funding into the future and like really believing it.
Yeah.
Because, as much as a lot of us in the space see it as like obvious, like that is the future, there's still a lot of people in the world that don't, and their stock price has bounced up and down because of it. And, it's not an easy decision to make, right? Like it's something it's definitely a risk. I do want to make a little bit of a pivot here. So I want to talk a little bit more about the work that you're kind of actively doing with Virtuleap now. So you talked earlier about this idea of VR being an embodied digital format, having it engage and capture like the whole body. I think there's a term that you use called like the cognition crisis. And then you've got some flagship products around like enhanced VR, secondary product around Cognaclear VR for various different things around monitoring and digital therapy, and then also for screening and MCI. Could you talk to us a little bit about the cognitive crisis and about those kind of core product offerings?
It can be a controversial topic, depending on who your audience is. It's pretty clear to me that TikTok mechanisms and the algorithms running them, they're becoming very sophisticated in knowing how to distract us. The fear of missing out, FOMO impulse, is becoming stronger and stronger from my point of view. People are lasting less and less time able to concentrate on, let's say, watching a Netflix 30-minute thing. Within a couple minutes, they already have this like jerking impulse to like check their phone and see what's going on somewhere else. It happens very, very rapidly through the kind of the intelligence of those kind of social dopamine hacking mechanisms, whatever you can call them. Our distractibility is getting higher. Our attention levels are suffering. In the scientific literature for years and years, you can see a very clear correlation. If your sustained attention skills, your ability to sustain your concentration on something, if that mental muscle goes down, you're susceptible, your propensity for mental health disorders, mental health issues, your likeliness to be in depression, it just goes, proportionally up in the opposite direction. So I see it as something that we're already in. I think with the researchers who are looking into things like TikTok brain, they call it, they're too slow to be able to give the results out by the time that we even know. And I think as human society, we always retroactively address these things, but I think we're in a cognition crisis. I think our children, the youth in general, everybody, in fact, but particularly, I think we should be concerned about the youth. ADHD is something that a lot of people in the neurodiversity kind of theme group, it's very touchy. I can't say things necessarily that's true and someone's going to agree with me. Some people will say ADHD is just what it is. It's not a disorder. Don't call it that. Don't label it. But from my point of view, attention deficit, forget ADHD. I think we're going to be saying, not in 5 years, not who has ADHD, who doesn't, in terms of its kind of manifestations, and that's our ability to concentrate. And what we have done with VR and neuroscience is create a product called Enhanced VR, which is a therapeutic. That's a library of exercises designed by neuroscientists to hopefully make you aware of your cognitive strengths and weaknesses and what caricature you are, where you're overdeveloped, where you're underdeveloped. How does that relate to why you are the way you are in life, and maybe give you tools that can help you kind of develop on those weaknesses, be more wholesome in your life because of you appreciating cognitive fitness just as much as you probably already do physical fitness. Cognaclear, the second product that's launching in August, it's a screening tool, more of a diagnostic for really the space of Alzheimer's, being able to detect mild cognitive impairment, a precursor to Alzheimer's, not just in your 40s or something, but maybe even earlier. Symptom tracking through the power of VR, and the most special thing about VR is not just the engagement, but the data collection. So yeah, the second one is very much more medically oriented. The first one is general population.
The data collection thing is interesting. But what are some of the things that are different that you can collect with VR? Because I hear people talk about this a lot, right? Like talking about the idea that VR can track X amount data points more than what we can track just on a 2D screen. There's a company called Cognitive 3D. I interviewed Tony, their founder, a few weeks back, and they're doing some really interesting stuff with data collection in 3D spaces.
Right.
But in the medical field, especially, I feel like this could be a really vital way to understand people's illnesses and how to treat them. So I'm curious to get your take on like what are some data points that you think are interesting that we can track in VR.
I mean, Tony, another very long-standing founder, who stood the test of time. But the kind of stuff that they do, VR is just like, people don't understand what we're sitting on. Our data infrastructure, for example, captures frame by frame, not just your psychometric data that we're capturing from the content we've created to capture for your cognitive, assessments and training, but also side by side your physicality, your posture. We can know the posture alignment of your spine. We can know the gesticulation of your arms. We can track and detect the most subtlest treming of your hands and knees. HP Omniset, which was a very cool headset that, shame on you, HP, if anyone's listening, they just like unplugged that way too early.
Unfortunate how often that happens. Yeah.
HP, I have so much to say. But that device had physiological sensors plugged in, like heart rate variability, pupil dilation tracking. They had an algorithm, a little bit buggy, I would say, but an algorithm that took those physiological sensors. It was running in our system for an MIT study where we know whether the user is focusing or not. We know their cognitive load. We know their stress levels. So like, it's minimum 300,000 data points every 3 minutes about the human condition, order of magnitude deep data. That what can we understand about the correlation between attention, cognition across 20 plus categories, and its correlation to physicality. Like, I'll give you an example. There's a study that maybe 6 months ago came out where they were able to predict Alzheimer's in someone based on their spinal alignment. Like, physicality, it's like, we got to go back to those cool stories of the, kung fu master at the top of the hill that said body and mind are one. One will, we kind of worship the mind in a way that we kind of devalue what the body tells us with micro gestures, micro signals, and there's correlations there. And VR links it all together in one device. You don't have to create a Frankenstein system anymore. It does it all. I mean, last thing I'll say, Apple, there's a device, Apple Vision Pro. It's got a patent as well associated to it, where they have the correlation between facial gesture tracking and mood analysis. So they're on this. They're on this. Hopefully, it's not the double-edged sword of using it to manipulate people to buy stuff. But because that's always that with VR, especially. You have data collection of this kind and all the negative things that can happen, Black Mirror kind of stuff, and then you have what I want to do with it, which is understand neurological mysteries. So
it's tricky. I think that's it's like the most intimate technology we've ever created, right? Yeah. Again, talking about that idea of brain hacking, it's like that ability to tie a technology so deeply to your senses, to your eyes, to your ears, like to be able to integrate it, allows you to do magic, like literally teleport to other worlds with your friends. Like, it's insane what you can do. Yeah. But there's risks to that, right? Like especially when we live in a world where it's like centralized companies that have capitalistic incentives, and it incentivizes innovation and incentivizes them to build these amazing technologies. But it does create questions around data privacy and like what's that can be used for and all that sort of stuff. Especially working in your field, I'm interested to get your take on this. And we're totally going into like world of speculation at this point, but not sure if you saw Three Body Problem on Netflix, but the way their devices work is in this sci-fi show is like neural interfaces, right? And Apple has a patent for neural interfaces, and there's a literal I wish I remember her name, but there's this girl that streams video games on like Twitch where she'll use a brain scan to associate brain waves with buttons on her controller, and then she'll play video games with her mind.
Hmm.
It's essentially a neural interface, and she's a pro gamer that can like play at a high level literally just by thinking and staring at the screen.
Yeah.
So this idea of neural interfaces is like becoming more technologically feasible. It seems like a path that we might go down more and more. Neuralink and Elon is obviously on the cutting edge of it. What's your take on neural interfaces? Do you think that's something we'll ever end up adopting?
I mean, that's the real VR, right? People say VR, but it's basically just tricking your visuals. Right now, the devices are tricking your visual sense about, which is, it takes up 70%, I think, maybe up to 80% of the processing power and storage of your brain, right? The visual sense is the master sense. When you trick that sense, that's why the rest of the senses kind of subserviently kind of say, okay, this is kind of seems real. And so that's why VR for pain management is the first mainstream application of VR for an FDA approved reimbursable solution by applied VR. That's the reason, because the pain receptors in the brain, when you're in VR, they significantly dampen. Why? Because the visual sense is being tricked into believing there's another world, and the other senses go, oh, well, whatever's happening in this body, for some reason, they don't really understand the mechanism, but it happens. So right now we have VR, but it's really not true VR. It's kind of like this in between. And until we have a neural interface and this magical stuff of, Neo in the Matrix or Ready Player One, really, because in Ready Player One, he still wasn't really in there, even though he pretends like he is. I mean, the bodysuit and stuff, but it's a neural interface to really hijack your spinal, your central nervous system, Personally, I have no clue. I think there's going to be some interesting fumbles in that world that are not so pretty, but it's inevitable. The thing is, I live in Spain. I'm here enjoying the weather kind of happening right now. I use VR to transcend whatever barriers keep me from walking on the beach or going on a hike or doing some traveling. I prefer the real world. So in a way that it kind of feels a little dystopia to me at the moment to even think about it.
Yeah, I think that's something that everyone who works in this industry struggles with a little bit, is like balancing how interesting and cool these technologies are with like the real world still pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I think there's a weird perception that like if you're the VR guy, then you don't appreciate reality or something. And it's like, well, hold up. I got the Coronado Bridge and a little sliver of ocean out my window right here, and I'm loving the sunshine. And like,
Yeah.
whenever I'm overwhelmed, I don't put on my VR headset. I go sit on my balcony and like stare out at this nice little view, or I take a walk and get my body
Yeah.
moving.
Yeah.
I love going down to Seaport or going on a hike. Like getting outside is valuable. And I think that I actually find that these virtual worlds give me a deeper sense of appreciation for physical reality, and it makes me act differently. It makes me like really want to put my phone on airplane mode when I'm going out and like appreciate the water and the trees, and like I look at trees differently. When I look at when I look at a leaf on a tree when I'm going on a walk, I started catching myself going like, wow, that it's just so vivid. Like I can see all the lines coming out of these
You're on a
veins,
mushroom trip, my friend. We need to anthropologically do a study on you.
At VMed, there was this guy that old VR, and I'm totally forgetting his name, but he had this like virtual lab where like people would come into the lab and he'd show them VR for the first time. And you could imagine years ago, this was like even more pixelated and like not lifelike, right? And the thing he would do that was so interesting is the second they would take the headsets off, he would put a rose in their face and be like, appreciate this rose, look at this rose. And I love that. I love that. It ties into what I was just kind of sharing from my own personal experience. It's like when you're away in this virtual reality long enough, everything in physical reality like starts to be much more vivid, and you can really appreciate it, I think.
You can go. I think what you're describing is very similar to what people in a different completely world of let's say Tai Chi or meditation or anything where you get to focus and accentuate any of your senses, and it somehow allows you to it's not just VR, but I think VR, like what you're saying, is maybe one of the pathways that I haven't actually considered can help you. it's kind of like we're always in automatic mode in life. After a certain point, a certain period in our lives, we've kind of created a bookshelf of, ready-made reactions and ready-made ways to receive. Every tree is the same tree. No one's looking up anymore at the leaves, right? It's because it's just leaves, Nothing. The next thing, that object that comes and approaches you, is nothing novel. Whereas in VR, I guess you're training yourself to look at everything as a novelty, because that's the whole kind of effect of it. And so maybe that kind of lingers as you exit VR. You have that, you're kind of being trained to look at objects and look at the world as if it was a just rendered creation.
Yeah, this I love what you said about intentionality, because this is in the workplace. This is something I talk about a lot with VR. Is like there's all these advantages to remote work, right? Like we can work from all over the world. You and I can have this conversation from different parts of the earth, right? Like that's really cool that we can do that. Video and phone calls, and the ability to work asynchronously is a big piece of that, because our time zones are so different that if I can start doing something in Miro or on a Jira board, and then you can wake up the next morning and keep going, and then I wake up and I keep going, like we can work so much more effectively together because of these tools. But what they lack is this sense of intentionality. Like when we hop on a 30-minute video call with a group of people, there's not a lot of thought put into a lot of those meetings. Typically, we kind of run an autopilot, and it's just like we're looking at a Jira board because that's what we do in these meetings every week, versus having like a legitimate agenda and like, what are we doing with this Jira board? Why are we looking at it? And I felt at Arthur, by meeting in VR and doing those type of sessions in a platform where we're all in this shared 3D space, the way that we communicate just changes. Like it kind of removes that autopilot and makes people really be more thoughtful about the ideas that they share and the questions they ask.
it's it's actually quite simple in a way. It feels like it's just, you need to disrupt the normal sense of yourself, to make that space for this kind of conscious presence, right? Into what you're doing, what you're saying, having a name. It's actually worth an article. You should put something into paper for that, because I think it's very key.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I think this idea of intentionality is really interesting. Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. I might write something up on this kind of breakdown of like individual versus asynchronous versus group
Yes.
work. And I think the group work piece is where I'll double down. I think this idea of intentionality is very interesting. But with our last few minutes here, I do want to get into some go-to-market stuff. So this is an area, this is part of why I do the pod, is like I think that there's a lot of amazing creatives and a lot of amazing technologists that are building in this space. And a lot of them have been around a long time. They're the people who were the earliest to come, and they're the ones who've built all this great stuff, right? Like I can't build a hardware device. I can't code 3D worlds out of nothingness or design and shape these amazing textures and lighting. That's not me. I'm a words guy. But what I do know really well is I know enterprise sales, I know marketing, I know how to communicate and position these ideas with businesses, and like what the objections are and how to work together with business leaders to have successful programs. Like that's the type of stuff that I really focus on. And so with the show, I always like to ask founders a few questions about those type of things. So when we're talking about go-to-market strategy, talk me through a little bit about like who is your typical customer, like who's interested in being able to track this data and be able to use these tool sets.
For a long while, because it took us about 2.5 years to come out of stealth, we had to create things that ultimately are for a wide range of population, people who have a lot of, let's say, mobility restricted in a wheelchair. Our content is designed to adapt to that. Colorblind settings, font settings, so many things had to be back and forth testing with hospital partners to ensure that it's the maximum comfort, maximum accessibility before launching anything. So a lot of our partners for a long time were just research partners until about a year ago. We started getting inbound requests that steadily became, up till now, it's about 15, 20 requests every month coming in. And it's typically 70% hospitals or clinics that want to license the tools. The B2C version of Enhanced VR, for example, has a limited access. You can only access 3 of the 15 games. If you have a corporate account, you get access to all of them. And then we have a suite of typical enterprise tools, like one remote control that allows a clinician to remote navigate the whole thing, survey engine, things like this. So when that all went live, we started getting these inbounds, and then we started knowing who is actually coming in and asking for it. We go, oh, well, reality is telling us that we shouldn't be focusing so much on what at that moment we were focusing on schools. We were thinking, oh, how do we get in the education sector? No, well, look at reality. We're getting like two, maybe three a month of schools versus 60, 70 inbound requests from hospitals. Our focus at the moment is by next quarter. Last quarter we closed a funding round, late C, 2.5 million from a Portuguese VC, and then so that gave us some time to focus on making sure we can create a SaaS platform that allows us to free ourselves of manually following up with all these inbound requests, create a system that's DIY, which we plan to launch and go live by the end of next quarter. That's our biggest focus. We also had a lot of requests where people didn't want to subscribe to our service ongoingly. We had a problem with retention at first with just playing the games. People didn't really know what they could really offer the carrot wise to their users to keep them on month by month by month using our product. So what we found out was they needed some kind of like artifact. So we launched a couple months ago a cognitive assessment report that's personalized to every user that they can only get access to once they finish all 15 games. And then they get an updated one later on if they keep on playing it to see improvements. Once we have that, we launched it. It's $100 a pop to export it. And now everyone seems to be interested in that. So we had to like go iteratively and figure out what the hell is the carrot. Because if we get people on board, we market to them, but they don't stay. That was a real problem. And I think we're on the, past the hump of that.
When you so it's interesting you have like the kind of limited B2C model, and then the focus has kind of shifted into hospitals as like your main B2B approach. Where do most of your leads come from? Like, is it typically the B2C folks telling hospitals about it? Is it hospitals coming to your website and just like word of mouth, or what are you guys doing outbound? Like where do most of your leads kind of get generated from?
It's all, I would suppose, because we've been, 6 years since we pivoted properly into what we are right now, but 7 years of really being launched, a lot of stuff builds up, and then suddenly you're just word of mouth from the US all across to Europe to Asia. We have that. I suppose we've earned it to be known. When side by side with the cognition crisis, as I keep calling it, so like, ominously, I think people start looking at that. There's so many therapeutic areas being investigated by neurologists, neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, more and more. It's escalating. And so I think it's the timing as well, because we didn't have that about a year and a half ago, the level of inbound we have right now. But there is no outbound. Has never been a sales focus. We do not have salespeople. In fact, of the 17 people we have on board, I'm the only non-technical person. So I've been juggling investors with sales opportunities, with research opportunities, and in no particular order. I could be improving all of that, of course, but it's just been iterative. And I think, again, it's a matter of surviving until the right timing.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Like that concept of rising tides raise all ships, right? Like you've hit timing on a real problem as that problem's getting a lot of attention and being studied, and that brings more and more people to finding you as a potential solution for that. Can you walk me through like an example of a B2B deal, like with one of these hospitals, of you have that first conversation to them kind of closing a deal with you? What does that process typically look like?
We're trying right now to focus on hospital networks, ones that have, 20, 50, even 100 across one of them, and then an innovation manager team that we can work with, build a relationship, take 6 months before anything potentially happens, and then hopefully maybe even another 6 months, maybe more, to even close the deal. But that's the long cycles of what we're dealing with. It's, anything that comes into the SaaS platform, it will mean that they come in, they just base the number of user accounts they want, and they pay with their credit card credentials, and off they go. They have access to a knowledge center that we'll be launching as well. Hopefully minimal technical support, but offering that. that's the majority of the SaaS. But the ones that internally we're going to be focusing on is those hospital networks, going towards, let's say, pharma companies as well, and insurance companies, because we do have a lot of interest in those areas, and we look for people who are in those teams. Sometimes, like in a company like Roche, they have so many people who are interested in VR and they don't even know each other. It's hilarious, so you have to find out who are the players in the company, do the whole sales focus, and then go through the process of seeing if you can get to a pilot stage. And unfortunately, I think most of those big ticket wins have to start with a pilot, and then the pilot goes into something bigger. Whereas the SaaS ones hopefully creates that kind of Excel sheet forecast that investors so desperately want from us VR companies.
Yeah, this is interesting. So there's basically like a B2C model to get exposure to patients that might be interested about this sort of thing. And that gives them something that they can maybe share with the medical programs that they're working with for help. There's the SMB offering, which you're kind of just raise some money so that you could ramp that up and have something that's that ongoing kind of predictable revenue to keep the business growing. And then there's this enterprise or like larger deal structure where it's like hospital networks or groups of hospitals. When dealing with the hospital networks, what is like a typical buying committee? Is it like the IT group? Is it like a specific type of doctor? Or who's the actual personas that tend to come to you guys?
Invariably, it's a innovation, who's in the innovation team, and then once you get someone from that innovation team to be, to buy in, to be your internal champion on their end, then that person typically will go and find a therapeutic team in a particular area, let's say epilepsy, or I don't know, cancer, or Alzheimer's, and find one of the key, either a KOL or even someone internal who is a doctor leading that area, that specialty, and then they have to bring that person into a follow-up kind of dialogue. And then that is what either the chemistry is there and it leads to directly into a pilot situation, or it doesn't. But the champion in the innovation team, then the champion's mission is to make something happen, and I think that's pretty much 90% of the way it works in this particular case.
Sorry, I'm a husky pup bouncing around in the
No, I
background.
thought you were being robbed. That would be a podcast.
No, just a rambunctious puppy.
You battling in the background.
Yeah, I'll go grab my samurai sword and start slashing around.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. The innovation team as a champion is pretty common, I think, for virtual reality platforms. They tend to be more aware of what's going on, and they kind of can help find which teams need it the most. You've been around the space for a while, so I'm sure this has changed from when you started to now, or maybe it hasn't. But do you feel that it's still in a place where like most of the doctors that you're being introduced to by the innovation teams, this is like their first exposure to VR? Or do you feel that most people have tried VR at least like once or twice by the time you get to them?
The latter, man. Totally. It's not what it was 5 years ago, certainly. I don't get the question of how do I get the hardware anymore. No one. Maybe they ask about the hygiene post COVID. Like clean box and these kind of things really are awesome to have, but no one asks, how do I get the hardware? How do I get the headsets? Can you give me that too? No, they don't. They sometimes in the big ones, let's say for the big hospital networks we're going to chase, maybe they're going to try to incorporate it into a master deal where the hardware is also looped into the budget, right, allocation. But in general, the people we talk to are savvy enough to know about the viability and efficacy of VR, the value add on top of anything else. And even if they're not, they don't actually criticize like they used to do about 5 years ago. I would have some conversations with a lot of naysayers, especially during the times of Oculus Go, which was the most dreadful thing to ever happen to us. That thing, I'm so glad even just saying it right now, I felt goosebumps.
Have to start somewhere, right?
But that was a bad time for our use case because it caused a lot of nausea, a lot of instances of these things where the 3 degrees of freedom didn't allow the body to, right? About it. So it's very rare for me to even think of an instance where I had someone ask anything that was an introductory question.
That's
At least,
awesome.
yeah,
That's a
very, very
huge
nice.
that alone is a huge step for adoption, right? Is like we don't have to explain what VR is to people anymore. Like there's a handful of people that are really experienced. Most of them are still probably relatively inexperienced, but the fact that they've tried it before, they're somewhat aware. That's a huge game changer in making these conversations easier to have and to be able to kind of shape a program with somebody. One other thought on the go to market stuff, and we'll wrap up pretty soon here. Partnerships is huge. That seems to be a trend. Is this idea of like ecosystems and like go to market partners? Do you guys have some kind of a partnership network, or is that not really a part of the strategy yet?
It's a huge part of the strategy because, but finding the right partners that have staying power, that's the issue. There was there's certain groups out there like Penumbra who has really a lot of power, a lot of huge network in the hospital scene, and they're trying to develop their ecosystem. Very, very promising. You have the deal with Cornerstone on Demand and Tailspin, and what they're trying to do in terms of distribution through the Cornerstone network. It has to be a pre-existing network. So, for example, us, we want to focus on hospitals. So we don't have a network for that at the moment, actually. So we're going to do it internally. That's our strategy. But what about using our solution and applying it for education? You know, something like Cornerstone developing it, or a Meta doing some initiative to allow schools there. They're doing a lot of stuff with schools. That's very key. It's just the problem is nothing has been sticking in any of those directions as of yet, or at least we haven't been invited to the party.
Okay, interesting. So I like that thought. It's like you have this core market that you found a really good market fit with, which is these hospital networks. And sounds like you even had to experiment with education and then found yourself with this ICP. And that ICP comes to you, you're feeling that go to market fit of like them reaching out and asking for programs. But then the future, if you want to expand and grow into new verticals, like if you want to go revisit education, then tapping into partner networks that already are established in those markets could be really interesting for expansion. I think that's a pretty cool way to look at it. And the other thing I'm always curious about when I talk to operators, like your CEO running this business, I think you mentioned it's like 17 people. As the operator, like what are some metrics for the business that you pay the most close attention to? Like when you wake up in the morning, what are a few of the top numbers that like come to your mind on things that you're thinking about?
Until the SaaS platform goes up, really we just look at inbounds. We look at number of registrations coming in from the B2C side. We're trying to see if any needles are changing, but they're very, very, they're not the way we would look at things until the SaaS platform goes up and we get serious on metrics. We look to a certain degree in terms of improving the enhanced VR, ensuring retention happens, in terms of people playing the games and then coming back to the games, people falling off at certain places. We're trying to do a lot of tweaking still the whole time until the SaaS platform launches. It's just like tweaking and streamlining the user flow experience. We're never like a B2C completely oriented company, because I think Meta had a lot of reservations with our kind of category of anything medical oriented at all. They've kind of served as a very big barrier to us ever. We never had a chance to ever be on the official store for the last 5 years, and not
Why do
even
you think that is?
they've never commented. I've sent so many messages, emails, stuff. They just completely give us the cold shoulder. We had people in the Meta team that were our kind of champions at certain points, but then they got laid off at those moments in the company. So then we had to start from scratch, and so we've never had a response by anyone on why we don't get accepted, or not even accepted. Not even a feedback, not
Mm.
even a reply or anything. It's been very cold shoulder. I think it's kind of maybe they don't like the brain training category, or some. We were forced into the B2B side of things initially, especially.
Personally, I think the B2B side's probably
Yeah,
it might have worked out as like a happy
blessing in
accident,
disguise, right? Yeah,
because I think for what you're doing, there's a really big opportunity there to support hospitals, pharmaceutical networks, like kind of moving in that direction.
no doubt, no doubt.
Um, the last question I got for you, I always ask this to people, especially founders. Obviously, you're solving the problem you want to be solving for. You just raised capital for it. Like you have your attention and your focus. What's an area that if you had infinite capital infinite time, and you were working on something other than what you're working on today, like what's the second biggest problem in the space? Like what's the biggest blocker that you would want to remove, that you wish someone would go out and go start a company to fix that problem?
I'm just so crazy about the healthcare applications, and I think being able to deal with addictions, therapeutic applications of the addictions. We've created a prototype, in fact, in that direction, but we just can't. It just derails us to go down that path. It's not our niche, but creating cognitive behavioral modification applications that are designed to, you know, everything from smoking to the hardcore addictions. Things with VR can be one of the best ways to rehabilitate. An application in VR that can help with particularly alcohol addiction, smoking addiction, these kind of areas.
That's an awesome area to focus, and I appreciate you recognizing your bandwidth and like where you need to focus your energy. I think, as we talked about earlier, startups really struggle with that sometimes. Is like we want to be experimenting because it's emerging new stuff, but we want to be careful where we double down, like where we put the majority of our time and focus. So anyone out there that's like trying to start companies in XR and thinking about where to start, these areas around trying to help people with addiction could be really interesting. Okay, I think that's the pod. This has been really exciting to learn more about your story. I love hearing your POV on the go-to-market side. Is there anything you want to plug? Where can people find you? Where can people learn about Virtuleap?
I'm a fanatic of LinkedIn. So look me up on LinkedIn, Amir Bozorgadeh. I will add you as long as you don't have the word sales in your title. Uh, my email is amir@virtuleap.com. Please feel free to send me an email there. If you are someone who is interested in research, or my main interest is research. Academic people like keep me happy. So anyone in those areas that wants to do studies together, I will definitely prioritize your contact. But please feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Salespeople, you heard it from Amir. Change your headline, thought leader in X.
Trojan horseman.
Okay, awesome, Amir. Appreciate you. That's the pod.